So hello. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be here. I'm just delighted to learn from all of you who study organizations. I'm a legal scholar, so I study the law, in particular anti-discrimination law, and especially with respect to gender and sexuality. So I have more to say today about the law, but I also have a few things that I'd like to say about organizations. I've titled my presentation, A Right to Non-Binary Gender ? Because I want to discuss whether there is any such right in the United States today, and in keeping with the theme of this conference, whether the master's tools can be used to promote any such right. But before going farther, I want to clarify what I mean by a right to non-binary gender. I want to start by defining a related term, which we just heard about, which is transgender. I use the term transgender to mean a person who does not currently identify with the gender associated with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So that includes transgender men and transgender women, like Christine Jorgensen, who we just heard about. Very often, transgender men and women bring legal challenges to institutions that refuse to count them as real men or real women. By non-binary, I mean something else. I mean a person who does not identify exclusively as a man or a woman, a boy or a girl. Non-binary is not a single identity. It's a label for a large number of identities. Some people identify themselves as agender, genderqueer, bigender, many others. By non-binary, I mean to include all of them. Non-binary individuals often bring legal challenges to unnecessary practices of sex segregation, practices that divide us into male and female groups. To give you an example, there's a group of non-binary New Yorkers right now who are suing New York state welfare agencies over the requirement that everybody who wants to apply for welfare benefits needs to check the M or the F box, even though the benefits have nothing to do with gender or sex. I'm particularly interested in policy projects that attempt to eliminate unnecessary sex distinctions, or when that's not possible, add options other than male and female. There are three questions I want to address today. First, is there a right to non-binary gender in the US? The short answer is, in some places, yes, and to some extent, but in other places, flat out, no. My second question then is, will courts protect the right to non-binary gender? Or are courts master's tools? And my third question is, what about pressure from LGBTQ-friendly corporate America? I'm not terribly optimistic about either courts or big business, but I'm not ready to give up on them either. So my first question, is there a right to non-binary gender in the US? Well, it depends. This slide illustrates two divergent trends in state-level legislation and policymaking on gender. In the blue states, the trend is toward a more expansive view of gender. Since 2017, these states have been busy adopting policies that allow any person to go to the DMV and get a driver's license that has an X on it for the sex designation, rather than an M or an F. This policy move builds on 50 years of work by transgender rights advocates who've made it easier to change ID documents from male to female or vice versa. The idea behind this move is that whatever's on your license ought to reflect your current gender identity. And adding an X is consistent with that idea. More than just identity documents, in the blue states, and also some of the other states on this slide too, there is a right to be free from discrimination on the basis of gender identity in employment and other domains of social life. Gender identity is usually defined broadly in ways that include transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming individuals. For example, here's New York State's definition. Gender identity means a person's actual or perceived gender-related identity, appearance, behavior, expression, or other gender-related characteristics, regardless of the sex assigned to that person at birth, including but not limited to the status of being transgender. In addition to prohibiting discrimination in forms like firing or not hiring a person, these laws also forbid harassment on the basis of gender identity. I don't mean to imply these rules are well enforced and there's no harassment or discrimination in the blue states. That's definitely not true. But these rules do set norms that shape behavior and promote a particular set of values with respect to sex and gender. One such value is autonomy, the idea that government entities and employers shouldn't be able to tell a person how to look, act, or live their life based on the sex that that person was assigned at birth. Another value is equality, the idea that being transgender or non-binary is just another normal human variation, and transgender and non-binary people should be treated as full and equal participants in social, political, and economic life. There are still barriers to full inclusion in these places, but in these states, at least, governments are thinking about how to take down those barriers. The red states, by contrast, are legislating a very different set of values. In 2020, Idaho enacted the first of 15 state laws categorically excluding transgender women and girls from women and girls sports. These laws sometimes purport to be about fairness to cisgender women, but a quick read proves that that's not what they're about. For example, many of them apply to kids in kindergarten, kids at an age where there are no documented sex differences in athletic ability that would really matter. Worse than that, 3 states have recently passed laws barring minors from accessing puberty blockers and other forms of health care that would affirm gender, forms of health care endorsed by every major American medical association. 2 states have passed new bathroom bills. Legislators admit that these laws are motivated by the desire to enforce a certain set of assumptions about what they call biological sex. On their view, biological sex is binary, it's either male or female. It's fixed at birth and can't be changed, and it's an objective phenomenon different from gender identity, which is subjective and untrustworthy. On these assumptions, being trans or non-binary is deviant and questionable and can be the basis for exclusion. Non-binary gender recognition is just a non-starter in these places. In fact, in legislative debates, they bring up non-binary gender as a sort of boogeyman. What's going to happen if we go down the slippery slope of respecting gender identity? Just a few weeks ago, Oklahoma passed the first law that bans any kind of policy that would put non-binary gender on identity documents. So we have dramatic polarization on gender. On this issue, as with reproductive rights, that people who suffer are the ones also marginalized by race, class, disability, childhood, old age, and other dynamics. Those who can't just get up and move to blue states, and who don't have other privileges that insulate them from the worst harms of discrimination. So if we care about this, what do we do? Well, one option is the court. In particular, the Supreme Court. It can overrule state laws, and sometimes it does that. So Obergefell versus Hodges, that's an example, the 2015 marriage equality decision. Another example is a 2020 decision called Bostock versus Clayton County, in which the Supreme Court held that employment discrimination is not permitted against gay men, lesbians, or transgender men and women. But I think the leaked Roe versus Wade opinion makes clear we can't rely on the Supreme Court to ensure gender justice. A broad historical view of the US courts reveals that they are the paradigmatic master's tools, structurally inclined to reinforce existing power arrangements, with counterexamples like Brown v. Board, Roe v. Wade, and Obergefell being exceptions to the rule. If you read Obergefell closely, you find out it's more about the importance of marriage than it is about the importance of equality. And the Bostock case, unfortunately, is very much about the literal words of the law. It doesn't invoke many values, and there's still debate over whether it covers bisexuality, non-binary gender, restrooms, sports, or healthcare. Both Obergefell and Bostock were decided before conservatives became the 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court that they are today, which is the culmination of decades of work by the conservative legal movement to put radically ideological conservative judges on the court, not just to overrule Roe, but also to pursue an agenda of aggressive dismantling of the federal government's ability to regulate business, while at the same time allowing governments at all levels to reinforce traditional social norms and religious beliefs. So we can't rely on the court. Another master's tool, corporate America, corporate America can boycott regressive states that are passing laws to enforce their particular vision of biological gender. This happened in 2016 when North Carolina passed the first ever bathroom bill, which then it repealed a year after as a result of boycotts, notably the NBA's decision to pull the 2017 All-Star game out of North Carolina. But where is corporate America this time around? We haven't seen red state boycotts. I've been wondering why. According to preliminary research from political theorist Joanna Wiest, who's been studying corporate protests against state-level anti-transgender legislation, these types of boycotts are unlikely to occur when multiple states pass versions of the same legislation all at once. I'm a person who lives in Nashville. Business is booming in Nashville. We've got Oracle and Amazon building new campuses, despite the fact that the state passed a record 5 bills last year targeting the LGBTQ community. Amazon reportedly is offering all of its employees up to $4,000 a year to go get abortions or gender-affirming health care out of state. So what then? I think even if tools like litigation and corporate pressure are limited strategies, the potential upsides are still greater than the downsides. It's true, the Supreme Court's a big threat to gender justice, but it's important to recognize the Supreme Court takes only a tiny fraction of all cases, and there are still many good judges on the lower federal courts and in the state courts. One thing people don't realize is that over the last 5 years, transgender and non-binary litigants have been winning a ton of cases. One example is Gavin Grimm, a transgender young man who sued his school for refusing to let him use the boys' restroom. He won his case in a big opinion by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the court just one step down from the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court declined it to take the case, which means that Grimm's victory stands, at least for now. Another example is Becky Pepper Jackson, an 11-year-old transgender girl who sued to challenge a West Virginia law that would have excluded her from playing girls' sports. She won a preliminary victory, allowing her to play while the case goes to trial. An example of litigation brought by a non-binary person is Dana Zim's case against the State Department for refusing to issue them a passport with an X on it. Zim argued the State Department's policy was just plain irrational, and so it violated federal law. Courts sort of agreed with that, but they weren't quite sure. And while Zim's case was pending, it took many, many years, the Biden administration came in and decided they would change the policy. Now people can get an X instead of an M or an F on their passport. Reading these cases and all the other many cases brought by transgender and non-binary people over the last several decades, one thing that really impresses me is how often a judge will admit, hey, I started out not knowing anything about transgender people, and then I learned about it from the stories I heard in the courtroom, in the briefs. And then the judges come to see how exclusion violates our Constitution's guarantee of equal protection, as well as federal statutes that forbid discrimination on the basis of sex. Most judges still think that their professional role requires that they use legal reasoning to decide cases, not impose their own preferences. And sometimes you can make a strong legal argument that will persuade a judge to set aside politics. Some say if we work through the courts, we only legitimize what's fundamentally an unfair system, and we draw attention away from the more radical changes that we need to our democracy. I think this is a false choice. Social movements can work on multiple fronts at the same time. I think we can advocate reforms that would take power away from the Supreme Court, like term limits or adding more justices, while also pursuing lawsuits to put a stop to laws that target transgender children. I also think the relationship between litigation and politics is more complicated and harder to predict than people who make these trade-off arguments imagine. So sure, it's possible the Supreme Court's going to reverse all the progress that transgender and non-binary people have made. The court could even decide it's going to reconsider marriage equality after it gets done eviscerating Roe. But sometimes losses in court can spur political change by mobilizing social movements, a phenomenon that legal scholar Doug Najim calls winning through losing. That's what the conservative legal movement did. They used the Roe versus Wade decision to mobilize political support for the pro-life cause. And that's something I hope the other side will try to do now. In this moment, I wish we'd all be thinking broader questions, asking, why isn't reproductive justice in our Constitution? Why isn't gender justice in the Constitution? Why aren't they explicitly there? The Equal Rights Amendment was defeated in the 1970s for reasons including the fears that it would lead to gay rights, abortion, and government-funded daycare. I think those would be great things. Those are things we ought to have in a constitutional democracy in 2022. This would be a big change, amending the Constitution, not a short-term project. It'd be a generational struggle. I would like to see that struggle, but I'd hate to see people abandon smaller, more incremental projects on the theory that things have to get so much more worse before they can get better. To borrow an idea from another legal scholar, Dorothy Roberts, I think we should ask whether the reforms that we want are reformist or non-reformist. So her question would be, what kind of a world does this reform help us to imagine? Does it help us to imagine a world of radical gender autonomy and equality, or does it constrain our imaginations? I think there's a lot of incremental litigation that can help us move towards radical change. As for business, maybe boycotts aren't on the table, but corporations can send their lobbyists to work behind the scenes and persuade state legislators not to pass the worst versions of these anti-LGBTQ laws. They can support the community groups and legal organizations that are on the ground fighting these laws. And they can advance social change by listening to their own transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming employees and adopting the supportive, inclusive policies that those people are asking for. I'll conclude by underscoring we cannot assume that either lawyers or employers are going to save us. Law is fundamentally conservative. And despite what I heard from the earlier panel, I'm not convinced that business is about anything other than making money. Neither is a substitute for organizing politically. That's something that has to happen. But I'm not ready to say either that we should abandon these master's tools.